Joining me now is columnist with The Australian, Nick Cater. Nick, let's talk about the day's big stories. And I want to start with Lidia Thorpe, Senator Thorpe. She's been out and about. First, she told 3AW host Neil Mitchell that the Prime Minister's insistence she get some help was laughable. Listen.
I laughed at that. If Albo wants to know about my health, then I've been diagnosed with an allergy to racist.
And of course, she has an explanation for that behaviour we saw outside the strip club, from which she has now been banned after hurling racist abuse at patrons. This is the explanation.
We cannot be racist to white people. Now, white people don't fall into that category.
Of course, she was accused of behaving in a racist manner. And what do you say to her response there, that you can't be racist to white people? She's certainly not apologising. She's doubling down.
Look, it's impossible for me to say what I really think on this, because I will be accused, of course, of being racist, since we now know that a racist is anybody who says mean things about Lidia Thorpe. That's, I think, now the official definition. It's absurd, it's ridiculous, it's self-absorbed, self-obsessed. Here she is. I gather from her Wikipedia entry that she turns 50 this year, but she still carries on like some petulant, narcissistic teenager who's been spending too long studying cultural studies at some third-rate university. It is laughable, it's comical. The idea that only white people are racist, you know, as if, you know, it's part of this fantasy that the extreme left have made up, and she plainly using it for her own convenience.
Now we're hearing that DJ Albo will be making a comeback. He'll be at radio star Kyle Sandilands' wedding. The PM is copping a little bit of criticism for this, Nick, given some of the colourful guests who'll also be attending this wedding, including convicted drug smugglers. I think this is a clever move. I know this might surprise a few people, but Kyle Sandilands is enormously popular. He may not be a cup of tea of our audience, but he is enormously popular, has a massive audience, and I think it makes sense for Anthony Albanese to spend a bit of time with him.
Well, absolutely. Make hay while the sun shines. A DJ Albo, I don't know that I'd be queuing up to listen to it, but, you know, if he thinks he can get some popularity out of it, you know, he should make hay right while the sun shines, I think, because, you know, we've seen these prime ministers before come in and they all look terrific for this honeymoon period, which can go on for quite a lengthy time sometimes. But the one thing is they always come down to earth sooner or later. You know, Albo, he looks a wonderful prime minister until he's not. So good on him.
Now, I want to just briefly get your opinion on this fantastic piece Warren Mundine had in the Daily Telegraph, where, again, he just fact-checked some of the claims of the yes side. And he wrote this. He said, let's start with a supposed claim that 80% of Aboriginals support The Voice, based on an Ipsos poll in January. The poll was commissioned by the Uluru Dialogue, the lobby group for the Uluru Statement, and it surveyed only 300 people. And Nick, yet we keep hearing that like it's a truth that's universally acknowledged and could not possibly be inaccurate. The additional detail is sadly lacking most of the time.
Oh, heaps of detail lacking. I mean, if you go to the ads that are running now for the Yes campaign, they're not even using the word voice. Like, they're not even telling you it is a voice you're voting for. It's a completely dishonest campaign. So I'm not surprised by this polling. I mean, a poll of 300 people is always a bit dodgy. But if it's 300... commissioned by the Yes campaign of the Indigenous community, and when nobody quite knows where the Indigenous community stops and starts, and that's why they're not going to be having a vote for this, because they can't actually pick the electorate. So it is all rather fanciful, and I'm just confident the Australian people will see right through this if they're not seeing through it already.
Well, let's hope so, because the campaign is going to only intensify. We're going to have every sporting code, every celebrity, every cultural figure is going to start pushing this and putting the guilt trip on the nation. But I've got to move on to this story. This is the front page of today's Herald Sun, a bombshell story from Michael Warner. And the Herald Sun reports Ambulance Victoria documents detail how Daniel and Catherine Andrews' car was travelling 40 to 60 kilometres when it struck a teenage cyclist in Blairgowrie, contradicting the Premier's claims that the vehicle was T-boned by the bike. The patient care report made by paramedics who attended the crash scene and buried for a decade is at odds with the Andrews claims. They came to a complete stop and turned right from a stationary position just moments before the collision. I mean, there's a big difference between travelling 40 to 60 kilometres and being stationary. It's a big difference between being T-boned to being, having a car strike a teenager from the front. There is so much more to this story, Nick, including the involvement of Labor-aligned law firms, the complete breakdown of procedure from police officers who attended the scene and in the weeks that followed. This family deserves answers, and I would argue so do the people of Victoria.
Absolutely, I think it's tragic what's happened to this family. We've seen that. Peter Credlin did a marvellous report on this last year, in which we saw that this whole T-bone theory is just nonsense. I mean, I'm a cyclist, right? And the idea that I caused damage to myself by driving into the side of a car, like it just doesn't happen that way. I mean, you have the car, which weighs about a tonne, and the bicycle that weighs about 20, as much as 5 kilos plus the rider. In a contest between the two, it is the car that is always to blame. And I think in this case, Daniel Andrews has kept this covered up for so long, and we've not been, well, perhaps not covered up, but not been fully frank with the facts. I think it's time he opened up about this. And don't you have an IBAC down there in Victoria? Aren't they supposed to investigate this sort of thing? I don't know.
Oh, you make jokes. Come on. IBAC, yes. I'm sure we will get another I do not recall session and nothing will happen as has happened in previous occasions. Now, I started the show by talking about Greens leader Adam Bandt. He wants to roll back legitimate tax breaks for property investors, and he wants a freeze on rents for 2 years, plus massive new investment in public housing. Have a look.
A rent freeze is both legally and politically possible.
Nick, you don't need to have an MBA to understand the disastrous outcomes of those sorts of policies, not just for your mum and dad investors, but for renters as well.
Yeah, well, Adam Bandt is, I think, functionally economically illiterate, and he's just proved it, hasn't he? I mean, if you put a rent cap, a cap on rents, just the same as you put a cap on the price of gas, as the Albanese government's done, what happens is the supply of gas dries up because it's not worthwhile people's while supplying it. This will be exactly the same here. The many mums and dads who invest in rental properties to save for their retirement won't be doing it once it becomes so hard and they're losing money. And already, we know a lot of state government legislation and regulation pushes all the benefits in favour of the tenant and against the landlord, who gets no rights if any of this is challenged. So it'll just push people out of the rental market. It'll push the number of rental houses down and the cost of those houses up. So it doesn't really help anybody.
Now, just finally, loving this story because it takes some bravery for Phil Jackson to come out and say this. Phil Jackson is a legendary NBA coach, 11-time NBA championship coach. And he's saying that he's not watching much basketball these days because there is just so much political messaging, so much woke nonsense in the sport. And he says, well, that you've got to get rid of that. You've got to have sport cater to everybody rather than being used as a vehicle to push a particular ideology down the throats of its audience. What do you think about that? Because we see the same thing right here in Australia. Multiple sporting codes, whether it's the AFL, NRL, Soccer Australia. We know they're all going to be pushing the yes side in The Voice. We see them take positions on all sorts of issues to do with LGBTQ community. And surely it must alienate a portion of their fan base, if not half their fan base.
Oh, hugely. You see it showing up in the ratings for American football, for instance. There's a big problem, and it is exactly as you say. What's happening is, you know, we're not allowed just to be amused or entertained anymore. We're not allowed just to tune into a sporting contest just because it's exciting or, you know, we get a buzz out of it. We have to have a lesson. There has to be a lesson to everything now. Everything's got a political message. You know, for goodness sake, I mean, you know, if I wanted a sermon, I go to church. I don't turn on Friday night footy, you know. So this is just you know, an example of what the sport is doing. It's killing itself. We know what happened, of course, to Netball Australia when they started to turn down legitimate funding. In the end, it'll kill the sport for everybody.
Well, they're still crying poor, Netball Australia, despite the fact that Victorian taxpayers are now had to step in to cover that shortfall, thanks to Dan Andrews having a little political stunt. They're still crying poor about that sponsorship being pulled, quite rightly being pulled. Nick Cater, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Rita.